All right, we're going to look today at Immanuel Kant and his critique of judgment, which, as I said, mentioned last time, is his third, also just called his third critique. And it's the critique of the power of judgment more explicitly, because it's Urteilskraft, it's the power of judgment, not just the critique of judgment, but the power. And this is, as I say, in the continental tradition, this is the critique. Kant regarded it himself as his most important philosophical treatise. Even if we don't agree with that, it's certainly his most important contribution to the field of art. But if you look at his three critiques, the first one is the critique of pure reason, which largely deals with epistemology, critique of practical reason, which largely deals with ethics, and the critique of the power of judgment, which is dealing with what, as I said last time, we now call aesthetics, although the discipline had up to this point not existed under that name. And so when we looked at the earlier writers, they didn't see themselves as writing in a discipline per se that would unite the pure reason and the practical reason. But that's what Kant thinks he's doing here. He's to some degree providing the bridge between what he has established already. And let me say something about the first critique. Does anyone read the critique of pure reason here? Do they do that in the philosophy department anymore? I'm not sure.
You read
a little snippet of it?
Yeah, intro book where it's like a survey textbook and you read a little.
That's about it. Yeah. Okay. I mean, we've offered it in the past. It's very difficult to read. I'll tell you, from my time in Germany, that I did classics there. So I was studying Greek and Latin, and the guys I was studying Greek with, two of them were philosophers, and they had to do Greek as part of their studies. It was just a requirement that they had to have ancient Greek in order to read Plato, Aristotle. But they said that when they came to Kant, they often read him in translation, the English translation, which I thought, but you're Germans. But right? So, I mean, I know that I find them difficult. It's really difficult to know what he means, and a translator has to simplify it so that it's comprehensible, because everyone blames the translator for getting for muddying up the waters. But that, in Kant, the waters are already muddy, and the English translator, to some degree, and that's what they read. They read the English translation of Kant in order to understand him. So he's a difficult read, even in the original language for native speakers. So let me begin by saying that. But in general, the first critique, and he puts this in the language there, he proposes a Copernican turn, the subjective turn. He likens it to that of Nicholas Copernicus. In which the mind is no longer conforming to an objective world out there, which is what Aristotle and Plato would have shared in common for all their differences. There was a world out there to be known, and it was our task to understand that objective world. And he proposes, Kant, an experiment. Remember back to Descartes. Descartes proposed this hypothetical scenario in which he can't trust anything that even he has seen, and the things that he's absolutely certain of are the moon and the stars and the heavens and the constellations, and now he knows that he can't trust them. Well, he's responding to Galileo there. I once thought that this is the way cosmology worked, but now, because of Copernicus, I don't think it works the way it used to under the Ptolemaic cosmology. So Descartes, back in the early 17th century, is talking about the effect of this, and it changes his philosophy. And so he said, what can I be certain of the fact that I'm thinking? I may doubt everything I observe, but I don't doubt that I'm thinking. And so this method, he doubts everything, and that's his method, the method of doubt. But the one thing he can never doubt is the fact that he's doubting. And if he's doubting, he's thinking. If he's thinking, then he exists. So he begins with the method of doubt as a means of achieving certainty. I can't, like, let's start from ground zero. I doubt absolutely everything. I won't, the cosmology which I thought once was true, now I don't. Let me be more radical and not only doubt the cosmology, let me doubt absolutely everything, except that I am doubting, and if I'm doubting and I'm thinking, and if I'm thinking, cogito, ergo sum. Right? I think, therefore I am. So that's the beginning of modern philosophy to some degree, under Descartes, the French mathematician. And it's interesting how that trope or the metaphor of a Copernican shift figures in Descartes' thought, but also in Kant's. So Kant proposes once again the Copernican turn, but now it's not through the method of doubt, it's through the way of, it's a shift in perspective. It's no longer that the objective world is outside of us and our thoughts must conform to it. He says, let's flip it around. What is it within us to which these objects must conform in order for them to be true? So the locus of goodness, beauty, and truth is no longer an objective standard, it's a subjective one. It lies within us. That's the Copernican term. Now he proposes an experiment as a way of looking at it differently, but his whole philosophical system is related to this Copernican Toerner, or the subjective turn. So in the history of Western thought, that cosmological shift had huge consequences in their imagination and what it did with philosophy. But here, that's exactly what he did. He flipped it around and thought there must be categories within our mind that are objective, that will hold on to the appearances as we see them. And that will be the means of certainty. And a whole philosophical system can be built on that basis. And so that's what he does in the first critique. And he does that, and he constructs an epistemology according to certain categories of reason, which he says are, the criteria by which we will be able to think at all. And then he moves the practical reason into ethics. So in the first critique, he's dealing with truth, and the second, he's dealing with goodness, and the third, he's dealing with beauty. If you want to talk about it the way I've talked about those goodness, beauty, and truth, those three attributes of God, which were seen objectively, and poets historically would try and imitate, right? Mimetically, through mimesis, you would try and imitate a standard of goodness and beauty and truth, and God was that standard. And God is not us, he's outside of us. He's not a standard in the sense that he can be seen, but in the sense that these are his necessary attributes and so forth as well. But then the shift takes place in Kant, really, where there is a subjective and yet universal, because you can't throw Kant into a postmodernist camp quite so quickly, because he insists that subjective judgments are capable of attaining universality. He insists on that. So by the subjective turn, the turn to the subject rather than the object, don't go immediately to the conclusion, which might seem obvious, that means that he is basically endorsing relativism and moral relativism, intellectual relativism, etc., etc. He insists that the subjective judgments have a universal character. He insists upon that. Now, whether he's correct, that's another matter. But he never thinks that he is bringing in postmodern relativism. It's unthinkable for him. He's trying to establish a more certain and a better way of holding on to these things. And he's responding largely to David Hume when he does that. Although not in the third critique. In the third critique, he quite pointedly mentions the man we looked at last time, Edmund Burke. And he says that Burke's discussion in philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, his distinction between the sublime and the beautiful, he says that was earth-shaking for him. This was the moment. Yes, he's got that absolutely right. So he's in total agreement with Burke on the fact that there's no overlap there. They're a very different experience, and not just, as I said to you last time, as it was in Longinus and everyone before that, that there's the beautiful, there's the more beautiful, and then there's the most beautiful. And the most beautiful is just that thing we call the sublime. Right? So there are standards of beauty, and there's a continuum, more or less. Whereas come Burke, just to reiterate, the beautiful was a certain type of affection. It had an effect on us that we call beautiful, and then there was a different effect entirely, which we call sublime, and there is no overlap at all because they're totally opposed experiences. That's what Burke said. Kant follows him in that. I said to you last time that, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, this book, and I'll mention it again, by M.H. Abrams, The Mirror and the Lamp, which is romantic theory in the critical tradition. This is written back, gosh, when was this written? 1950. Are you sure? I thought it was 54. You might be correct, but it's 53.
4 years and I spent history and I can't even get the date right.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm not very good at it myself. So a long time ago, and this is a groundbreaking work, and just to give you a sort of précis of his thesis, Abrams is arguing that up until the mid-18th century, so in the neoclassical era, the model of artistry is that like a mirror. Right? I've described that already, the ut pictura poesis, to hold a mirror as up to nature as it were, to show her true self, not just the surface. It's the nature of nature. That's what the mirror does. It's representing there, and it's representing it objectively. And so when we look at discussions of art, it's all about how can I, as a writer or a painter or a sculptor, attain that standard, that objective standard? How can I imitate that? That's what they're trying to do. They're mirroring it. They're representing it, representing what the nature of the thing is that they're describing. And you can see it. It's probably easiest to see in painting. Like it's a visual depiction. And so you look at the painting up until that era, and it's very clear that they're very clear. Like you can see what you're looking at. You know what it is. And what's in the center of the picture is what you're focusing on. It's front and center. It's not what's on the periphery of the painting. It's front and center, particularly in the Renaissance, where there's this sort of triangular principle. You know, you've got the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus there, or something like that. Same in the sculpting. You've got Mary holding her the dead Jesus in the Pietà, if it's a marble statue. That sort of, but it's very focused. We know what is, and we can reason and we can present objectively what the truth and goodness and beauty is. That's clear. Come the 18th century, we get something in painting called landscape painting. They take a great deal of interest, and this is even before what we will call the Romantic era, in landscapes, the whole picture. And so I guess I could go through a course on art here. I'm not really fitted to do that, but you would see that there's a broad canvas at that point, and the figures even in the center of it are relatively small. The human figures are not front and center. Remember, even the school of philosophy, the school of Athens, you've got Plato and Aristotle. You've got all these men around, but these guys are in the middle, and Plato's pointing up and Aristotle's pointing down. You know, we know the universals by looking up, says Plato, and Plato says, no, we don't. We know the universals by looking at the particulars. So the real contrast, but they're front and center, and then there's all these other guys in the margins. Landscape painting has very small human figures in the midst of a large, so that's the 18th century. Now come the 19th century, then we start getting changes, and the changes could be expressed as in there's a turn inwards. This Copernican turn inward, so the locus of objectivity, the standard of beauty, truth, and goodness lies within the artist, and that's expressed interestingly through the lack of coherence in what's being put in painting. So think about Impressionist painting. Some people like it, some people don't like it, but it's a little hazy. What you're seeing there is it's not clear with your eyes. There's something being depicted there. It's not that they couldn't have painted clearly. It's they've intentionally chosen not to do that. In the Romantic period, there's a painter called Caspar David Friedrich, and he often presents sublime landscapes, so a storm. We dealt with Burke last time, and he will depict exactly these sorts of landscapes. Or you get an individual on a mountain peak looking down over a mountain landscape. And you've seen that famous picture of a guy standing on the top of a mountain and looking out, and he is standing, and you're thinking, if I'm afraid of heights and I can imagine that giddy landscape, that's an expression of the feeling of the artist within, because it's not the man standing on the peak that's really the interest. It's your feeling about what it would be like to be that man in that situation. So it makes you think inwardly about that. It's not out there, it's the immensity within there. And that is that big shift that takes place. Now, if you wanted to trace what happens in Western art after that, we could talk about a different thing, but maybe I'll do that later on the course in terms of painting. But there's a big shift there, and it is reflected in that thesis. So what was previously mirrored objectively is now expressed inwardly, outwardly. So it's expressed. It's the lamp that lights. There's a light within us that it's expressed outward. That's what the author, the painter, the sculptor is doing. He's expressing the truth that lies within him. Shift from the objective to the subjective. He still thinks, does the artist or the poet or the painter, that it has universal validity. So don't think that when we start the Romantics, they are immediately going to the postmodern position, because it doesn't occur to them that would be the place. That would be the case. It does now to us in retrospect. Say that's when you do that shift and towards the subjective, how can you prevent subjectivism? How is that possible? But just saying that. Now, that thesis is of the mirror and the lamp is marked, and this isn't something I noted years ago, and I'm trying to get the title of the book now, because it's quite a good book, and I've got it here. And where do I have it here? Because I want to get the title right. It's a man by the name of Thomas Dixon. 2003, so around the same time that I brought my book out. From passions to emotions. That's the title of the book. There's a subtitle. The creation of a secular psychological category, which is linked with this word emotions. To emote is to push outwards, to move, emote, out, express, push outward. And this is a new word, emotion. We use it all the time. He notes in this book that come the mid-19th century, although he traces it back a little earlier, a new category emerges, and it subsumes, there's the word emotions, previous words like the passions, the affections, the sensibilities, and so forth. So even Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. Sense is reason, sensibility is, well, like the character, Marianne, emotional. But they wouldn't have used that word. Jane Austen would never use that word. But now we would use that word. So it's the expression, an expression that has now a universal validity. He traces this, does Dixon, to a Scottish philosopher by the name of Brown. He says he invents the word to try and come up with a secular psychology. And with it, he overthrows writers like Augustine and Aquinas and their standards of their whole theological system. I'm in agreement with his thesis. I think that, and some of you've asked about my critique of psychology, sociology, etc. It's connected to this, not his thesis, because I had the thought before the thesis, hence the title of my book. But I think that there is a category which is supposed to replace the theological system and does effectively replace it, namely the field of psychology, which is then pushed into anthropology and into sociology and so on and so on. And then in sociology, I mentioned last time, the Burkean categories of the individual self-preservation and the social utility of self-propagation, those two locuses, so the individual and society, become conflicting points. Well, that's the sublime and the beautiful clashing there. Anyway, I don't want to spend any more time on that per se. I just am giving you a sense of where I think why these things are important and they play out. We're going to spend more time on Kant now, but I've done this every class pretty much. I'm going to do it a little bit more now because I'm getting closer to the relevance of the changes, and I'd like to sketch out the big picture before coming closer to it. A comment or question at this point before I do that, because I just unburdened a lot of stuff all at the front end. No, okay. So I said last time that Burke's enquiry presents the effectivist position. When I say the effectivist, it's related to this word, one of the words that is the emotions replaced, namely the affections. Does anyone talk about the affections anymore? Or to be affected, as in with the A? Most people get the word affect wrong and spell it with an E. What's the difference between an affect and an effect? Your English teacher will say, well, it's obvious one's the affect. It hits you, whereas the effect is something you do out there. It's a cause and effect, right? But the reason you're confused is because affections, after this psychological turn, have objective validity. So what's the difference? The addition, right? The difference between an affect and an effect is gone. Because the thing that is affected is the universal thing, me. And I express that. So the effect of action and passion has been eliminated in the process of introducing this new category of emotion. Anyway, but this is an effectivist position because he emphasizes how we experience things, how it happens to us, how we feel about it, how we're moved. So the beautiful is a certain type of feeling that we get from a certain type of object. And it has a certain affect on it. It makes us feel a certain passion or sensation. And likewise the sublime. And that goes all the way into, it gets picked up by writers like Adam Smith and so forth, by the way, in Scottish philosophy, who's really influential on economic theory. Adam Smith, the invisible hand and all that sort of stuff, he picks up on all that, but I'm not going to go any further off the beaten track here. But so Burke's account is empiricist. It's through our senses, the five senses, right? And it's regular, it's predictable, but, and this is, I want to note, and I said this last time, Burke is the pivotal figure. He effectively de-emphasizes the importance of the external world, because he's talking about the effect on my senses. He's not talking about the objective beautiful, the objective sublime. He's talking about the sublime effect or the beautiful effect. Affect. He's not talking about the beautiful out there or the sublime out there. It's the beautiful effect, the sublime effect. So there's already an element of ignoring the objective validity of the sublime and the beautiful. So there's already a caving in this period. And he also wants to emphasize the uses of objects. So now it becomes, again, in English philosophy, utilitarianism, which I mentioned last time, Jeremy Bentham, the calculus of pain and pleasure, both Burkean terms, wants to say, well, what's the world for? Not what's the nature of the world. How do I conform to what is true and good and beautiful, but what can I do with it? Because I am the standard of objectivity. It's how it affects me. And so he will talk about it. And here's the final shift. And this is my piece. And I don't know, I haven't read it anywhere else, but I think it's obvious in some way. There's a shift in the view of human nature in this period. And it moves away from the idea of, so one of the Christian understandings of human nature is that we're made in Imago Dei, right? This Latin term. In the image of God. So God created man, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Right, in the image. It's right there in Genesis, the Genesis text. What does it mean? Okay, fine. So there's and it's not obvious from the text. It's not immediately apparent. It takes a lot of discussion and thought to tease out what that means. To some degree, it depends on the question, well, what's God's nature? Let me just say this on this. In Genesis, it says that we are made in Imago Dei. It says that Jesus is the image of God. The image is the image. He's not in the image of God. He is the image of God. Colossians 1:15. It's a difference there. So how do we know what Imago Dei means? To some degree, you have to look to Christ. That's part of the answer of solving this riddle. What does this mean? How does Jesus think? How does he act? What's God like? Now we can see. We can observe. How does he treat others? How does he relate to God? What's his character like? Those things are being teased out there. But one of the certain features is that being made in the image of God means that we are capable of judging, and we are also subject to judgment. And to be able to be subject to judgment, we have to have agency. We have to be able to ago, I act. To be an agent is to have the capacity to act. And if you're able to act, you can be responsible for your actions. There's a moral responsibility, a personal responsibility, hence the sense of justice. Right? So that sense of agency, that's the historic legacy. A fuller, I've said that in my book quite plainly, a fuller presentation, and even more correct than I put in my book, is to understand human nature as being person. God is in his nature personal, like the tri-personhood of God, right? God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. These are the three persons, but I'll get into the deep weeds of theology if I go down this path. I just simply want to draw a distinction between what exists up to this time, personal agency, the objective standard, and what now comes in its place, which is something that is not quite the same. In fact, I think it totally corrupts the whole idea, and it's this idea of the organism. What's the difference between seeing oneself as a personal agent and as an organism? Two very different categories. Nobody disputes that we have an organic nature to some degree. We share this with the other animals. In fact, we share it with everything living. It's organic, right? It's part of the circle of life. But organisms have no personal agency. They have no moral responsibilities. They are, to some degree, the products of their instincts. They're basically under the thrall of their instincts. They have to do, and they don't have a choice. They act in accordance with their need to preserve their own lives, which Darwin outlines in Origin of the Species, right? Self-preservation, that's the means by which Darwinian evolution works. Survival. right? To preserve my own life. That's the whole motive. That's how life works. It's through this. And he says there's a continuum between the amoeba and the man. We're all organic, and we all are there trying to preserve our own lives. That's what drives it. But that's a very different thing, the organism versus the personal agent. Organisms don't have volition, per se, and they certainly don't have moral responsibility or accountability. They act, and there's also a lack of a distinction between the organism and the environment to some degree, because an organism is always ingesting or interacting with the environment around it. So think of an amoeba. It's always being stimulated by what's going on around it, and it is responding to it, but it's always being moved. Like, think of a simple organism, like an amoeba or anything like that at the most simplistic level. It's constantly interacting with the world around it. It's totally dependent on its environment. Indeed, an organism needs to be connected directly to the environment. Environs simply means everything around the organism. And modern environmentalism is connected with this view of life. Organic. Who doesn't like organic food? It's natural. Who doesn't like natural food? What is natural food? What's organic food? Why is organic food healthy? Why is natural food healthy? What does the word health mean? All these terms need to be defined. Is poison not something we experience in nature? When a lion hunts a zebra, is this not a natural thing? Is this not killing? Is that it's natural for the lion to do that? Yeah. These questions of the organic view of human nature. I could go on a long digression. I've already digressed a fair bit. This starts to replace it. So the organic view of human life and what the artist does likewise comes out of this. So the artist expresses what is within him or her in accordance with the environment around him. So then we get the idea of the zeitgeist and the poets being the conduits of the spirit of the age, and they express the spirit that is within them, the organism, but also in the environment, their culture, or the world in general. And then we get the Hegelian idea of progress. It's sort of an organic notion. Now, this is not Kant, this is now Masson. Okay. But I think it's there, and you can feel free to disagree with me, but this notion of the organic view of life, to which my beloved Coleridge is the best spokesman. I don't think Coleridge is wedded to this view, but I do think his contemporaries are, because they all want to question what life is. What is life? Is there no difference between the life of the amoeba and the life of the human being? Not according to David Suzuki. It's all life, and it's it's not just a circle of life, but there's an ecosystem, and we're all tied into the ecosystem, and we're indistinguishable from it. How arrogant for us to think of ourselves otherwise. Well, this is the argument of seeing human beings as just organic matter. It's an attack on human agency and responsibility and so forth. Anyway, I say that because I think that this view that Burke presents and Kant presents is, for all of its attempts to hold on to some sort of universality, and they do, nonetheless they are giving us a view of human nature which is largely that of an organism, which is affected by other forces. Right? And then we hold on to that through an intellectual act. But there's no way of being effective agents anymore, or responsible agents. Or at least when I say no, it's been the boundary there of responsibility has been blurred so significantly that it's hard to hold people accountable. So in Romantic writing, to give an illustration, The hero is usually an orphan who suffered great wrong, or a criminal, or an outcast, or a wanderer, or a vagrant, an individual on the margins. That's the hero. Very different from the classical hero, who's usually a prince or an aristocrat or a warrior. Somebody of strength. Now it's somebody who suffered great ill. In our day, it's who? Who are the heroes? Any marginalized community. You can fill in the blank. I'm not going to let you fill in the blank because you fill it in. But any marginalized community, and you can name them. They've got a letter attached to them. Those are the new heroes. Why? Because their organic sensibilities, their feelings, have been ostracized by the collective groupthink. And so it'll be just to allow those sensibilities, which were marginalized, to now be included in the whole picture. It's an organic postulate. Anyway, so much for me. Let's go to Kant. He, as I said, he agrees with, as I say, Burke has an organic view of life. I think Kant does as well, because he identifies the beautiful and the sublime as terms under which different kinds of objects of experience might be subsumed. They're different types of objects, and they have an effect on us. And they're just different types of stimuli, if you will. Kant doesn't use the term. I'm using the term because it's more amenable to this view of the organism, and I think it's a helpful way of seeing it. And he says that effectively it's a psychological term. So a sublime experience is a psychological experience, and a beautiful experience is a psychological experience. So it's internalized. It's part of the Copernican turn that I spoke of. And that means, just to reiterate what I said earlier, that means that the criteria of judging art shifts from how do we produce it. So if you go back to Horace, how do we write good poetry? What are the objective criteria? Aristotle is interested in the same. So is Spencer. In fact, you'll find the whole of the tradition. What are the objective criteria for the artist to attain in order to produce it? So the aim is on the producer. Now it's on the consumer. That's another shift. So it moves from how do we produce it, but how do we attain certain effects? So it's not how we produce it, but how we affect it. Which is not the same thing. How do we get people stimulated the way we want them to be stimulated? How do we get people to be moved emotionally? That is the new shift. The reception. And so there's a reception theory, or the reader's psychology, or the reader's response. In biblical criticism, there's something called reader response theory, where you're considered, you read the biblical text, and what you're not trying to do is discern what the author intended or what the text objectively means, but how does it affect me? What is my response to the text? That's the consideration. Well, it's a different way of reading. It's the psychological reading. I don't know if you've been Bible studies where some people just gravitate towards this. I'm reading this. Well, this makes me feel really unhappy. This makes me feel very sad that Paul said this or whatever. And I just go, I don't even know how to engage with it. Okay, yes, all right. And for me, it's like a category mistake, but that's the whole point. It is one of us is committing a category error. How does this make me feel? That's not the point. That's not the initial point, at least if you take it from the perspective from which Paul wrote it, or any of our forebears. That's not the main thing. But we are attuned now in this Copernican or psychological turn to think that that is the objective thing. And I will say right now that even the best defenders of this in the academy, like Jordan Peterson, falls foul of this. He still thinks that. But he thinks, again, that psychological turns have objective validity. So he's with Kant on this. He's not subjectivist. He said, no, but it's true everywhere. It's empirically verifiable. Yes?
What you just said, but how is that different? Let's say if you hear like a sermon, but and the person doing the sermon, the pastor, but like and he does it, and he's looking at the Bible. We're looking at the Bible.
Yes.
But he makes us feel like more. Like he can still put a feeling on me.
Of course.
Right, but that's different from me reading a text and like I'm not feeling that from the text, but he's showing me how I'm supposed. Like if we're talking about sin, I kind of want to feel like sin.
Again, in the ancient world, they have a hierarchy, which the Christian tradition will also acknowledge. The reason, the will, and the passions. And the reason governs the will to subdue the passions and make the passions fit with the objective reality which the reason recognizes. Because we can rationally discern it and we can logically discuss it, and there are such things as the laws of logic. And if the laws of logic don't hold, then we can't think. Which is true, by the way. We can't even think if the laws of logic don't hold. We're just expressing our emotions. So this is the way it works historically. The reality is what reason beholds and informs the will to make the passions accord with that. Whereas now the passions are gone and they are replaced by the emotions, and the emotions dictate what the will ought to do and how reason ought to be. So it's two ways of looking at it. It's not sense and sensibility. That's not extreme enough. That's just Jane Austen in her world a couple hundred years ago. Now, if I feel strongly and it's my identity, and this is who I am, then we ought to be able to will that, and that ought to be the objective standard socially, right? So you get it more or less, yeah. And appeals to reason from this vantage point are just a power play. Well, why would they be a power play? Because Burke just said they're a power play. Everything's a power play. Right? I feel the sublime when I feel powerless. I feel that something's beautiful when I feel powerful, but all of it's about power. So if I'm arguing rationally that we shouldn't be driven by our emotions, they'll just say, well, you're oppressing me by appealing to reason. Because everything's a power play. Well, those are Burkean categories. He's muddied the waters here. At any rate, the waters. When I say they're muddied, they're not. They're settled now. The mud's now settled. It's settled, and now the emotions dictate what the will ought to tell the reason. And there's an organic sensibility, the feelings of all parties, not just the academy, the thinkers, the philosophers, the theologians. The life of the mind has been overthrown. Anyway, in the third critique here, Kant reorients the aesthetic discussion. Now, you'll note last time that we saw that Burke used examples, including from Milton, that famous passage when Milton's describing death and saying there's a sublimity here in the obscurity, because he said, what does he say? Describing death, he said there was a shape. If shape, it might be called that shape had none. So what is a shapeless shape? That's what he's describing. So it's an obscure, it's impossible to define. It's not because Milton is not capable of very clear and distinct language, but he's describing death. And that description of death is it's terrifying. And it had the likeness, there's a lot of words of likeness there, the likeness of a kingly crown on it, whatever its head was, whatever that thing was that was like a head. So that is the description there, and he uses artistic, and he quotes Virgil as well, and these are artistic descriptions of the sublime. Those are what Longinus would also have used, by the way. So Longinus was regularly appealing to standards of sublimity and quoting the Bible and quoting Homer and so forth. So he would do that. The reason I say that is Kant gets rid of all that. It's no longer the artistic sublime. He's not interested in that. He reduces the sublime only to natural objects. So no longer the realm of art and nature. Art is gone. Burke had art and nature. So you'd appeal to our feelings in the presence of a vast mountain or a vast ocean, or when reading Milton's poetry or reading Virgil's poetry. So art and nature. Kant gets rid of the art. The sublime is only in relation to nature. And that has its effect. So the metaphorical reach of the sublime is exclusively with natural objects. Now the effect of this allows him to argue that the sublime is not particularly important to establish our inferiority relative to natural might. Why do we feel? So he's getting to Burke says that we feel in relation to a great object relief. Why do we feel relief, says Kant? Because we know that the ocean might drown us. And yet, we feel a relief from that because we're not drowned. And what we're really reflecting on is our own capacity to have those feelings. So we're not regarding the object, we're regarding our feelings in relation to that object. So it's not, I'm responding to the ocean or the great white shark that's dipped beneath the surface of the ocean. I'm really reflecting on my feelings in relation to that and the distance I perceive between the object and my feelings. It's really an internal observation. It's a feeling of relief. A great illustration is when William Wordsworth in his great poem, it's a great poem and I've forgotten the name of it. What's it called? The preface. It's not the preface, the lyrical baths. It's not the preface, the prelude. Gosh, sorry. Mind cramp. The prelude, and he is describing going to Mont Blanc, which is the highest mountain in Europe. And it's so high that when you go there, there are days in which you can't see the top of it because it goes up into the mountain. So it goes so high, and you know that feeling in the presence of a mountain, the sense of the vastness and your smallness in relation to it. And in the 18th century, there are pilgrimages to these deist sites like Mont Blanc. So the deists wanted to see an intelligent design in nature. And you go to the Mont Blanc is a natural feeling of what the immensity and power of God must be like. So people are going to Mont Blanc on pilgrimages to get a natural sense of awe, which is commensurate with what it must be like to be in the presence of God. All sorts of problems with the deists, and Kant repeatedly attacks the deists. In fact, I think his account here is to some degree going after the deists. But Wordsworth goes there in order to experience this. And while he's going, he's climbing up and up and up and up. And then he gets lost. He gets separated from his guide. He's going up and he's not that far from the top, and he's wondering where the top is. And he goes up, and then he's lost his guide, and so then he's walking, and he walks along the road, and he meets somebody, and he says, "Where's the top of it?" And he said, "Oh, you just passed it." So it's a humorous episode because he's just missed the whole experience that he's got there for. But now this leads him to give this extended digression in which he talks about the real sublime object, which is his imagination. Because the imagination was what led him there to begin with. He imagined what it would be like to be there, and now he having seen there, and it wasn't such great shakes that he got to the top of the mountain. it was really his imagination that was the great thing. It produced the greatness, the grandeur, the sense of immensity, and the sense of awe. So he's awed by his own capacity to imagine something awesome. That's what Kant's doing, I think. And Wordsworth is reflecting on that in his poetry. It's helpful to have illustrations because Kant's language is challenging, but that's really what he's reflecting on his capacity to imagine an infinitely great object which he didn't experience in nature, because you can't experience it in nature. The immensity of his capacity to imagine a being so great that it transcends our capacity to perceive it. That's the sublime. Yes?
I thought that meant like me conquering nature.
No.
So it's not.
No, he's reflecting on his capacity there.
But then what would that be like? If I see that mountain, I want to see it like torn down. Like, is that?
You want to conquer it, but that's not what we're. No. Okay. No, and I think people who climb mountains get the sense of that was tough. I just did it, right? Right. Well, maybe if not, maybe it'd be very difficult. But I've met people die on the way to the top of Mount Everest, in fact, and even more so. Then that's a greater accomplishment. The threat to your life, you get to the top. There's an exhilaration that you've conquered it. But that's not what Wordsworth is talking about. No, it's okay. But if you read that passage on the imagination, he is reflecting on the thing that it's the failure that leads to it. It's not the success, it's the failure. He failed to have the sublime experience. And that's because there was no object that could fill that. But his mind was that thing that produced it. And hence, for the Wordsworth, the imagination becomes the great faculty. And for all the romantics, they all talk about the imagination. And I think there are differences between them, and we'll come to them in a few classes. We'll look at Wordsworth, we'll look at Shelley and Keats, and we'll look at Coleridge. And I think Coleridge is different than the others. So the pleasure that you take in a sublime nature reveals a pleasure in judging objects that are not the vehicles of a message. So it has to be purposeless, by the way. There's a sense of purposelessness in nature. They don't express the intentions of a creator. So Kant is going after what we would now call intelligent design. There's no argument from design, rather. So we don't know God from the basis of the things that we see in the world, which Romans 1 says we do. And most of human history, and certainly Christian history, has said. Like, we look at the world and we see evidence of God's wonderful design in the immensity of things and even in the smallness, like the wings on a microscopic fly. Like there's a terrific complexity there, which brings to mind those who are in those fields, or even mathematicians, or all thinkers. They're in awe of how beautiful and great the designer of this must be. But Kant gets rid of all that. It's not that, it's the reflection on a greatness without purpose. That's his. There's no communication of intention. Now he's not only going after Christians here. I don't even think that's his purpose. He's probably going after the deists, because the deists want to get rid of the Bible as supernatural revelation and see God's handiwork only in nature. In general, deists, quite a broad scoping movement, but in general, the deists want to see natural evidence of a creator, and that's what the deists do. And we can get rid of all this account of miracles. We can just see greatness in nature. And some of the American founding fathers were deists, like Jefferson and so forth, right? So they can talk about a creator or an omnipotence or a deity, and there's one, and it's the power that has produced all these things, but it's not the God of the Bible. It's a different thing. So there's a deviation of sorts, and I think Kant has them in sights. It's not Christian per se. It's more the deistic arguments that he thinks are bad arguments. So he thinks that there's a lack of intention in the sublime. But he's not arguing against this belief in divinity, but rather the purpose of, he uses this term. What did I do with it? That's what I did with it. Purposiveness without purpose. This is his phrase. This is why Kant gets translated. What a terrible phrase. Purposiveness without purpose. This is characteristic of the sublime. Now, why? It appears to have had a design to it. He doesn't deny that. But the sublime lacks the form of beautiful nature. Beautiful nature is something that we can perceive, and he agrees with Burke in the sense that the beautiful is something that submits itself to our capacity to perceive it. It's below us, it's beneath us, whereas the sublime is the opposite. It transcends our capacities. And there's purposiveness in the beautiful objects, but there isn't purposiveness in the sublime objects. There's a purposiveness without purpose. So there's a sense of a purposiveness, but there isn't an obvious one, whereas the beautiful has a purpose to it. So it's not the intrinsic beauty of an object, but it's the it's transcendence of that. What a terrible, mind-bending thought that is. Comments or questions at this stage, and I will then try and dig down yet further. But he's trying to unite the first critique with the second critique, and he's doing it through the third critique. Yes?
Is it the case that beauty and sublime, they're not found in objects, they're not universals, they're just experiences that we have in our minds?
Yes, yes. But they are universal, and the experiences are universal. They're subjectively perceived, subjectively suffered. You suffer the experience of the sublime or suffer the experience of the beautiful object. But what's universal about it is our capacities.
Unless you want to jump off a cliff and see if it won't kill you.
Now, this is why when you get frustrated with Kant and his distinctions, this is why I say we want him to take the jump off that Mont Blanc and experience that for himself. And then you would call that sublime. Nietzsche called Kant a horrible spider. Nietzsche was always good with the phrase, yeah. Spinning his webs and coming up with his ideas and made Nietzsche crazy. And he was crazy. Nietzsche was crazy. So eventually, at any rate, later on. Yeah, where was I going to go? I was going to say something there and I forgot. Oh. So Kant is let me come at it from a different angle here. Kant is trying to create this category of the sublime. He's not trying to create it. He's saying that it has this, and it is only in natural objects, and in natural objects that suggest a supernatural character, something that transcends the natural, and we have a perception of that in nature, but there's a purposiveness and yet without a purpose in it, because if it had a purpose in it, it wouldn't be transcendent. So he's holding on to a sense of transcendence thereby. Comments or questions before I go on my little tangent here again? I had lots of tangents today. The sublime shows that there's a disjuncture between the mind and the world. The beautiful thinks that the world fits the mind. It's something that when we look at the world, we feel comforted. We're made for this world. The sublime pushes us in the other direction. there's a disjuncture or a misfit between the mind and the world. Our mind was meant for something greater than any object in the world. So when we experience a hurricane or a tsunami or something of that sort, there seems to be a power so great there that we are not fit for it. That's a sublime experience. Now, to some degree, with the sublime, then, he's talking about an experience of God, and yet without a sense of purpose to it, because he, to some degree, is getting around the problem of natural evil, which goes back to what's his name? In the Portuguese earthquake, where's the theodicy argument begin? Do you remember? I've again drawn a blank on the name. The Jewish philosopher. Anyway. But the sublime dwarfs our concerns and sensibilities. So it really is, he's really connecting it with a perception of God. And yet without purpose, because he doesn't want to attribute all senses of awe and with God. The problem of evil that arises from Spinoza, that's his name. It would come to me. And the theodicy, not the Odyssey, but the theodicy, which my colleague Paul Franks writes on. The experience of natural tragedy and the earthquake in Lisbon, in which 20,000 were left dead, like this horrible natural event. How do we explain God's goodness in the presence of such natural evil? Kant is getting around that issue and not wanting to associate all awesome events with God's design. I think that's one of the thoughts there. So the sublime lets us glimpse things beyond our comprehension. It allows us to experience the limits of the physical world, and it generates these feelings of awe and terror, and yet doesn't connect them exclusively to God. So thereby he avoids the idea that God is the author of evil. Otherwise it is. Or he is. Well, let me talk about I could get in the deep weeds with this. If we're going to do the critique of judgment properly, you probably need to spend a whole semester on it, and I am thankful that I don't have to do that. I once did a course as a master's student. I spent several weeks on it, and I was not happy that I had to undergo that, but I wrote an essay on it. It's challenging work. And it is Baumgarten. I had it right the other day. Let me talk about a further dimension of Kant's thought. He writes a little treatise called What is Enlightenment? You ever read that? I'll stick it up on the screen here if I can. If I've logged in, have I logged in? Probably not. No, of course I haven't. Oh, stop it. So what's going on? In this little later writing, it's a little essay. It's around the same time as the Critique of the Power of Judgment. He talks about what is enlightenment, or in his term, Aufklärung, the German word there. The clearing up, this is the age of, whoa, that's a loud sound, of enlightening. He writes this little treatise. Now I'll put it up here, and I only want the first paragraph anyway, so just let me put it up here. I would cite it to you, but it's better if I do it exactly, accurately here. Oh, go off. There it is right there. Oh. First paragraph. That's all I want. What is enlightenment? Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage, when he has no say. Nonage is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. Think of mimesis. Think of the tradition of paideia, of education, of adults teaching children. Here it's taking the initiative yourself. Now he's not talking about parents and children per se, he's talking about the spirit of the age. We're not looking to the past. We're adopting the motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. That's the motto of the Royal Society. Make sure yourself, test and verify. Knowledge is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This knowledge is self-imposed if its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in indecision. So I'm going to stop that from happening again. In indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Sapere aude, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. There you go. It's the postulate of autonomy. I talked about the organism replacing agency. We will want to throw along with the organic view of life, autonomy. Every individual organism is autonomous. It has its own law. Auto means the self, by the way, and nomos, the law. Use your own understanding. You rely on yourself. You look within yourself. There's a shift, a seismic shift here. And it's reflected in the Enlightenment's view of prejudice. He doesn't articulate it here, he does it elsewhere, which is that prejudice is something that ought to be avoided. Now, what is a prejudice? A prejudice is a judgment about the world which we inherit from others, our society, the church, our parents, whatever. It's a prejudice that we have. You know that women are inferior to men. They're inferior in capacities, inferior in human nature, whatever. That would be a prejudice. Or that certain races are inferior to others. That we'd call that a prejudice. And so the Enlightenment was marked by removing prejudice. It wanted to get rid of all prejudices as a way, and the John Locke term for this was the tabula rasa. We want to go back to a blank slate. And then build it on genuine knowledge. So we're not going to just accept the church's teaching on this because that was based on the presuppositions of their age, but they're no longer our age in the scientific era. So it's the ancients versus the moderns things. We'll have a modern view of the way the world is. Thank you very much. So let's take the tabula rasa, and with that we will at least, if not get rid of, we will put on pause the prejudices that have been taught to us by our culture. And this is characteristic of the Enlightenment, but it's particularly characteristic of Kant, so much so that a very witty German, he's not witty in general, but he's witty on this point, pupil of Martin Heidegger by the name of Gadamer, Hans Georg Gadamer, in his work Truth and Method, says that Kant had a prejudice against prejudice. I think it's quite witty. In other words, he had an unexamined bias against bias. He thought all biases were invalid. I failed. A prejudice against prejudice, a preconceived judgment that all judgments were judgmental and not valid. And so if we couldn't see the reason for it, we would remove them and then see what happens. So it's a social experiment. The problem with the whole perspective, as Gadamer points out with Kant, and it would hold for the whole of the Enlightenment, is that they are employing a prejudice. So you can't avoid prejudices. They have a prejudice against prejudice. This is just a universal prejudice. So when they say that they're trying to go after universality, in Kant's case here, he's going after the objective validity of the world. Let's try the subjective turn in order to bring about the Enlightenment, because I think that's the aim here. What he is really doing is, as I say, taking a blank slate to the artistic tradition. And I don't think artistry has flourished as a consequence. I don't think the poets of post-Enlightenment are as good as those before. They're imitators. Where they are good, they are imitators, as they've always been, because there are good writers without a doubt. But they are following in the tradition. They're not cutting themselves off from beginning from ground zero. But this is characteristic of the Enlightenment, this prejudice against prejudice. And when I read that as a doctoral student, I thought, he's really got it there. That's exactly right. And I thought, and I was an early Christian convert back then, and the words were ringing in my ears as I was thinking about the Christian faith and all the stuff that I was being told. I thought, this is problematic being a Christian now, because I'm being brought into a world of thinking about the world which is different than the way I thought before, and now I'm the bad guy. I was never the bad guy before. I was the bad guy, but I was an approved bad guy before. Now I'm actually a good guy, but I'm termed a bad guy because I have different prejudices than I had before, right? The prejudices of the Christian faith, so-called prejudices. And then the words of Jesus, "Judge not lest you be judged," is being thrown at me. Like, who am I to judge that? And measure for measure and all that, right? But then the words of Jesus come to mind, that he says to the Pharisees, "Stop judging and make a right judgment." So it's not you can dispense with judging. You have to make a right judgment. So that's the issue in this. Everyone, if it's true that even the Enlightenment philosophers have a prejudice, which they just simply wield against prejudice, and prejudice is unavoidable, that is, the prior things that we use to judge the world, and language is one of them, and human nature is one of them, and our tribal biases, then what is the correct judgments that we ought to hold in order to judge the world? That's then the right thing. That's what I try and do on this course, is get us to think about what those would be. And they have to account for what human nature is really like, what good artistry is like. Are there objective criteria, or are they internal subjective criteria with a universal validity? I don't even know what those mean, by the way. Like when Kant talks about this, what exactly would that look like? And how do we see evidence of that? I noticed from Kant onward that the writing standard changes. It becomes less orderly. It becomes more organic. It becomes more expressive. There's a lot more stream of consciousness in writing. There's a lot less of before you wouldn't know what a writer was thinking or a character was thinking other than what they said, right? So when you want to know what Hamlet's thinking, he goes to the front of the stage and tells you. It's called a soliloquy. That's what he's thinking. But he has to speak in order for you to know it. Well, in modern writing, you get a lot of stream of consciousness. It's unpunctuated, hyphenated thoughts, and it's just like a dog's breakfast mess of ideas, and they're not organized because it doesn't have a purpose. It's just the experience, and they're reflecting on their experience. Okay. Is that a good thing for a reader? Do you enjoy reading people's stream of consciousness? It makes me crazy. But even if you like it, what it doesn't do is it doesn't equip you as an agent. It internalizes the way you look at everything as well. It makes you unfit to act. Then it leads back to the question which we saw at the beginning with Aristotle, when he said that human beings by nature love to imitate and they love to act. They love to act on what they see. Is the agency of our human nature being undermined by the new views of artistry, which are organic and expressive and claim to be about our identity, and yet they've not even questioned whether their view of nature has validity? So again, the LGBT or the hyphenated identities, they're all begging the question, but what's human nature? Have they ever sought to answer the question? Not to my knowledge. Or if they've done it, they've only done it for a group, but not for the whole. In which case, the humanities there are no humanities. There's the identities, but not the humanities. So there's an attack, and that was, again, the sort of thrust of my book, the crisis of the human sciences. Humanity's gone, human science is in its place. The psyche is the discipline. So that's why everyone goes into psychology when they come to a Christian university. They think that's where it's at. The real me is that person inside of me that wants to be expressed. Which is true in some ways, and in other ways, a wrong way of thinking about it. Anyway, so I've gone off on a different tangent there, but because I've had enough of talking about Kant and the Sublime. And I've illustrated it without getting in too deep on it, which it really could. He distinguishes between the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. You can get that all from the intro to it, quite frankly. There's the reason I chose this Norton anthology of theory and criticism is the intros are really good. They really are. I think they're excellent, first-rate stuff. So if you want to go to that, then have a look at that sort of subjective universality and the two different types of sublime and all that. But at the end of the day, I want us to reflect on the big picture here, and when we come to contemporary literary theories, and then start asking the four causes. Think about that. How does this theory fit with that? Remember M.H. Abrams' description of those four ways of looking at it? I think it's quite helpful, at least in distinguishing and discussing some of the strengths and weaknesses. I obviously have my own views strongly held. My purpose here is to get you to think about it and think through it and hopefully contribute to the discussion in a meaningful way. I'll leave it to you. Any final comments, questions, discussions? Yes, sir.
When it comes to different theories,
yes.
From my understanding is I have this certain box that I'm going to be boxed in where I can't go outside this. There's a certain box that I have, but I can make my own theory as long as it fits. People always say think outside, but
think outside the box. I hate that phrase.
I'm stuck in I can't.
Nobody can think outside the box.
Do you get what I mean? But as long as
it depends what the box is.
Well, I can't just start making there's no such thing as God. There's no such it can't go on I have a certain theory. My theories have to coincide with these universal transcendental theory and make a theory inside of that box. Like the
laws of logic, there are certain things that you have to presuppose, and these are what I would call the prejudices. So that is the world rationally comprehensible? What evidence is for that? What are the consequences if we don't hold those things? So I don't think outside the box in the sense that those are the box and that the box has been defined and I'll acknowledge those. And if I don't acknowledge them, I have no business teaching. Okay. Right? I think that at that point you have no business teaching if you don't think there are things that can be taught. If they can only be experienced and are subjectively, you learn it by walking through life, then what do you need a teacher for? I think you can convey things, and they're there, and they're discernible, and they're defensible. Like logic can be defended. Gosh, just go to the philosophy department; they will show you, and it's very clear where you're illogical. That can be demonstrated, and that's a good thing. That's a ground on which you can stand. There's a solidity there. But what I'm saying here, in this period, is the same things can be said about matters of goodness and also of beauty. That's the piece, and I think philosophy without those other things doesn't stand. And they're not saying otherwise. They're dealing with what stuff in their food dish, and this is my food dish. So I'm growling over it and saying, there's beauty and there's goodness, and it connects with truth. It must, because God made it so. Made us effective beings with bodies and passions, and there is such a thing as beauty and ugliness and so forth. Anyway, but that's it for now. Next class, we're on to Romantics. Wordsworth? I don't know.